is as old as time. So is the quest to find the killers. And when sleuthing meets science, new forensic tools are born. In the 1980s, one case in England would revolutionize crime fighting.
Two 15-year-old girls, less than 3 years apart, in the same general area.
It certainly looked as though there was one person responsible.
The breakthrough, DNA profiling, a genetic fingerprint.
The prevailing view was that DNA would not be stable enough to be useful in forensic science.
But the results are totally unexpected.
Every one of the cops were just beside themselves when they got that information. They didn't believe it.
It was quite a body blow.
2 decades later, DNA profiling is put to the ultimate test, taking on one of America's most notorious serial killers.
DNA became the cornerstone.
Wichita, Kansas, spring 2004. A newspaper reporter rushes into police headquarters. He has a letter he knows officers need to see.
The one-page document, and it basically has 3 Polaroid photographs and a driver's license copied.
The pictures show a woman lying on the floor and a driver's license for Vicki Wegerle. Wichita investigators know that name well. In the 1980s, Vicki Wegerle was the victim of a horrifying crime. A cold case that's still open nearly 2 decades later.
Vicki Wegerle was murdered in 1986. Her body was removed by EMS technicians prior to the police arrival. So we had no photographs of Vicki Wegerle as she laid at the scene.
Those were not our photographs.
Which can only mean one thing.
It was obvious that this was the killer.
Wegerle's hands are bound. A scarf knotted around her neck. And there's something else.
There was a moniker that was at the bottom of that letter.
A familiar and chilling signature. The initials BTK.
BTK stood for bind, torture, kill.
Authorities in Wichita began hunting BTK in 1974.
His first homicide was a quadruple homicide that occurred in East Wichita. The Otero family was killed on the morning of January 15th, 1974.
All 4 had been strangled. They were bound, and the youngest daughter was hung in the basement.
Overnight, locksmiths ran out of locks.
That was only the beginning. BTK struck again and again. By decade's end, he'd claimed 7 victims.
All of a sudden, we have a serial killer in Wichita, Kansas. and people were scared to death.
In Wichita back in the 70s, you didn't have to teach your children about the boogeyman. They were afraid of BTK.
BTK fed off that fear. In letters, he boldly taunted his pursuers.
BTK began today's letter with a question. How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper?
He lived on publicity.
Local police joined forces with the FBI in a nationwide manhunt. They studied every possible clue, searching for any lead. No detail was too minor.
There was a lot of work done to determine the type of paper, the copiers, and even down to the typewriter that was probably used to type out the first couple of notes.
For decades, crime solvers had relied on fingerprints, the only surefire evidence unique to each individual. But BTK was clever. He'd left no prints at any of his crimes. But at the Wegerly and Otero crime scenes, he did leave a clue. Semen, a mix of bodily fluids designed to nurture sperm cells. Some semen contains antibodies that can reveal a man's blood type. That could be useful if BTK had a very rare type like AB negative. Of the 8 common blood types, only 1% of people are AB negative. If BTK was like most Americans, he was type A or type O, one of many, many millions. But BTK's semen did not reveal a blood type, and BTK kept on killing. Then, in the mid-80s, BTK vanished.
He stopped his killing, and he stopped his communication.
Basically, BTK would become a cold case because there would be no activity. That he must be in prison, he must be dead, or he's moved on to another location.
Now, 25 years later, the macabre letter turned over to the Wichita police proves BTK is back, poised to slay again.
Now, a whole new generation of people were terrified.
But now, police have an amazing new weapon, a forensic tool that can turn almost anything the human body produces, from hair to skin cells to semen, into identifying evidence as rock solid as a fingerprint. DNA profiling. Long before it reached the crime lab, DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, fascinated scientists. They realized it is life's basic building block. In the early 1900s, geneticists Friedrich Miescher and Frederick Griffiths proved that DNA decides the characteristics one generation passes to the next. In 1953, researchers James Watson and Francis Crick used X-rays to show what DNA looks like, the famous double helix. Nearly 30 years after Watson and Crick's discovery, DNA was used for the first time to prove paternity. But it wasn't until the 1980s that DNA would catch a killer for the very first time. November 1983, Leicestershire, England. A typical Monday evening for a typical teen.
Linda Mann was a pretty, bright, top student who went to school in the village of Narborough. On a cold November night in 1983, she was taking a shortcut after babysitting on a footpath called the Black Pad.
The next morning, a man is riding to work.
As he cycled up this path, he saw the body of a girl.
It's Linda Mann.
She had been strangled, possibly with her own scarf, and had clearly been sexually assaulted. There was a full search made of the crime scene and the surrounding area.
Officers combed the scene for clues. Blood, threads, bits of fabric, anything that might tag the killer.
There was evidence of semen on the body.
And the police promptly put the semen sample to the test. And antibodies present in the semen reveal that their killer has type A blood. But it's not much help. Type A is one of the most common blood types in the world. In England alone, 1 in 10 males have type A blood.
That narrowed it down to several million people in England at the time.
So blood type alone is useless for the investigators. And science can do no more to find Linda Mann's attacker. For 3 years, the investigation sputters. Until a new shock leaves Leicestershire reeling. Someone sexually assaults and murders another young woman. Dawn Ashworth. And the attack is eerily similar to Linda Mann's.
2 15-year-old girls, less than 3 years apart, in the same general area. Immediately, the Leicestershire Constabulary concluded that probably the killer of Linda Mann was also the killer of Dawn Ashworth.
3 years after Linda Mann is murdered in Leicestershire, England, a girl the same age, in the same area, suffers the same awful fate.
Dawn Ashworth, another very pretty, bright, well-liked student from the nearby village of Enderby, was walking on a footpath one evening.
Dawn never comes home. A frantic search ends in grief and horror.
She had been strangled, also had been sexually assaulted.
Again, investigators find semen, and again, they employ the only forensic test they have. The results show Dawn's killer has type A blood, the same as Linda Mann's murderer.
It certainly looked as though there was one person responsible for the murder of both girls.
But suddenly, it looks like investigators won't need a helping hand from science. When a local teenager named Richard Buckland starts talking about the crime among his friends, police bring him in for questioning.
He said that he had seen Dawn Ashworth enter 10 Pound Lane on the night she disappeared. He described a few things about the crime scene that they felt he shouldn't know about.
And he couldn't account for his movements satisfactorily on the 31st of July.
After hours of grilling, Buckland breaks down.
He confessed to the murder of Dawn Ashworth.
And when they mention the Linda Mann killing, they're waiting for Buckland to own up to her death.
He totally denied any involvement in the murder of Linda Mann.
Which is not what they thought they'd hear.
We were firmly convinced that if he had murdered one girl, then he was responsible for the murder of the other girl.
Constable Baker is determined to bring closure to both cases. He's certain Richard Buckland killed both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. Struggling to make a case, Baker has an unusual idea. He has no clue how much this idea will change the course of history. Since Watson and Crick found the double helix in 1953, DNA and its mysteries had drawn generations of scientists. And researchers at the leading edge of DNA science were working right in Constable Baker's backyard.
I was aware at that time that Dr. Alec Jeffreys had been working at Leicester University in respect of DNA tests involving parentage of immigrants. And one of the things that stuck in my mind was the fact that he'd established that a young Asian child was in fact the offspring of people who claimed to be his parents quite firmly through DNA.
Dr. Jeffreys knew human DNA is mostly identical.
And well over 99% of our DNA is the same between people. That allows us to have 2 ears, 2 eyes, a nose, 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand.
But Jeffreys wanted to know more about that other 1%. In 1984, he discovered a patch of DNA that was unique to each individual, a sort of DNA fingerprint. And when Constable Baker thinks about Jeffreys' work, he has a question. If DNA can prove paternity, can it also prove whether Richard Buckland killed Dawn Ashworth and Linda Mann? It's a long shot. Semen decomposes quickly, so Baker's 3-year-old evidence samples might not be new enough. They've also been through the mill of field recovery, police storage, and unscientific handling. The samples are anything but fresh, which means they might all be completely useless.
So the position we were in 1985 is that there was a very interesting technique there, but we actually had no clue whether it was going to be useful in forensic science at all. In fact, when I discussed this with other scientists, the prevailing view was that DNA would not be stable enough to be useful in forensic science.
But the police are willing to try anything. They give the lab the crime scene samples. These researchers may know DNA, but they've never used it to solve a crime. The results of this real-world experiment are anybody's guess. First, technicians extract the DNA by dissolving the evidence. At that time, they needed a sample as large as a quarter to generate a DNA profile. Then, Jeffreys has to pinpoint the DNA fragments that are unique to their owner. To do that, he uses a technique called RFLP, Restriction Fragment Length Polymorphism.
And what this does is that it cuts the DNA into sections of various sizes.
To get the DNA portrait he needs, Jeffreys has to sort the fragments by size. Then the sample goes onto one end of a gel plate. Technicians apply electrical current, and electricity pulls the fragments through the gel.
The gel acts exactly like a sieve, and the small fragments are able to travel quickly through the gel, and the large fragments travel slowly. At the end of the process, we have an X-ray film, which effectively has a barcode on it.
It may look like random splotches, but that barcode is unique. In all the world, it belongs to only one person. For a century, fingerprints have been the platinum standard of identification. No two among billions ever found to match. If scientists can achieve the same with DNA, a substance that recurs in every cell of each organism, a revolution will be underway. And soon the results are in. The DNA from the Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth crime scenes are an exact match.
The two murders, they had been committed by the same individual.
But then the story takes an unexpected turn. The DNA portrait doesn't match that of the one and only suspect. Richard Buckland, who even confessed to the death of Linda Mann.
His DNA profile did not match the crime stain profile from either of the two murders.
Despite his tormented confession, Buckland didn't kill a soul.
Every one of the cops were just beside themselves when they got that information. They didn't believe it.
It was quite a body blow. We very much doubted the evidence with which we were being presented. We wanted to believe in it, but on the other hand, it was telling us that Buckland was not the person we thought he was.
On November 1st, 1986, the court convenes in the case of Richard Buckland.
The Crown Prosecution Service have been kept informed throughout the scientific investigations and have decided that the proceedings against Mr. Buckland shall be discontinued.
The moment turns forensic science on its head. The very first use of DNA profiling doesn't convict the suspect, it exonerates him.
It's very poignant, I think, that this very first case was used to exonerate an individual who would otherwise have stood up quite a good chance of being convicted of a crime that he had not committed.
But if Buckland didn't do it, who did?
Somewhere out there was someone responsible for the murder of two girls.
Now police have a tool for making their case, a DNA profile. The only thing missing is their suspect. In Wichita, Kansas, BTK was torturing and killing people long before DNA profiling came into existence. But now, investigators have science on their side and old evidence with new potential.
One piece of evidence that we had in all these cases was the DNA.
By 2004, crime fighters have honed DNA profiling to a fine art. Labs deliver profiles much more quickly. But the DNA in Wichita has spent nearly 30 years on the shelf. And investigators working the BTK case don't know if their evidence has stood the test of time.
Some of the evidence that was initially submitted included clothing and the fingernail scrapings from Vicki Wagerly.
The 80s era method that cleared Richard Buckland was very slow and required large samples. Now, technicians need only a few bits of genetic material because scientists have found a way to harness DNA's extraordinary ability to replicate itself.
It's actually a reaction that occurs in your cells naturally. Whenever you slough off skin cells, for example, you are regenerating cells constantly. Every cell that you have has the DNA in it. And in order to reproduce the cells, your body makes copies of that DNA.
By getting DNA to copy itself, technicians can manipulate a shred of evidence to power many tests. They do this using a process called PCR, short for polymerase chain reaction.
The main advantages to PCR are that you can obtain a DNA profile from a sample that's 10 to thousands times smaller.
The DNA samples are heated to a very high temperature. Heat pulls the DNA strands apart. When the pieces cool, an enzyme called polymerase makes copies of them, until that shred of unique DNA is big enough to analyze. That's how PCR works with fresh DNA, carefully handled by trained scientists. But that may not be the case here. The police fear the BTK samples are too degraded. It came from a crime scene. It's older than some of the lab workers. So officers wait, anxious for an answer. And Stedman provides one more than 20 years after the evidence came into police hands.
We were able to detect quality profiles from the sample that was collected from Josefina Otero's sock, as well as the fingernail scrapings from Vicki Wegerle.
Finally, police have a genetic snapshot of BTK. But Stedman has done all she can.
At that point, the DNA technology itself had done everything that it could to solve this crime. We needed to figure out who this profile matched.
They have one hope: CODIS. CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System, a directory of DNA test results from offenders. For years, law enforcement agencies have been building this database. By 2004, CODIS contains more than 1.5 million profiles, and investigators hope BTK is in there.
So we entered the samples into the DNA database to be compared to samples that were prepared by other laboratories.
But CODIS is no help.
We knew that our killer was one person, and we know that we have no other unsolved cases that have been submitted to CODIS come up with the same DNA.
And that's all they know. Unless BTK kills again or identifies himself, police have no way to get on his trail. It's November 1986 in Leicestershire, England. For the first time ever, police here just use DNA profiling in a criminal case. But instead of finding a killer, the test exonerates the lone suspect in the murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth.
We were then faced with, what are we going to do now?
Investigators feel that someone in their area must match their DNA profile. So they push the boundaries of the revolutionary new tool.
It was decided then that we would use the DNA and we would blood test everybody that lived in the 3 villages.
In a worldwide first, police launch a DNA dragnet across Leicestershire. Officers ask all male residents ages 17 to 34 to provide a blood sample. Since they know the killer's blood is type A, anyone with another blood type is home free.
That was able to eliminate 3/4 of these suspects, leaving 1,000 individuals to be analysed by DNA profiling.
It's still a massive undertaking.
In those days, it would take us maybe 2 weeks to generate a DNA profile. It was a very archaic method, very, very labour intensive, very lengthy, very expensive. And at the time, there was only a handful of people in the whole world who were able to run this technique.
Forensic science has given investigators answers, but not the ones they were looking for. Not one of the profiles matches the killer of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. Then, a lucky break. Out of the blue, a woman phones the police.
She'd been in this public house with a party of people from her work, and during the conversation, one of the party, a man named Kelly, came up with the fact that he had taken the blood sample for somebody else.
Officers question Kelly, and he says a friend paid him £200 to take the test in his place.
There was a man named Pitchfork.
Colin Pitchfork is 27, a bakery worker and a father of 2. He lives in nearby Littlethorpe.
Quite clearly, if Kelly had given Pitchfork's blood, there was trouble afoot.
They checked Pitchfork's record, found out that he did have a record for indecent exposure.
On September 19th, 1987, police arrest Pitchfork at home. After 3 frustrating years, police may have their man. To prove it, they demand a DNA sample from Pitchfork himself. DNA results have already shown that one man committed these crimes. Is that man Colin Pitchfork?
His was a complete match, with the samples left behind on Lindeman and Dawn Ashworth.
The probability of a chance match was 1 in many millions.
In 1988, for the first time in history, a court uses DNA test results to convict a suspect. Colin Pitchfork is sentenced to life in prison.
We realised that this was something which was going to go worldwide. It was a technique which couldn't be ignored.
The impact of the Pitchfork case actually laid the groundwork to the whole future of DNA profiling.
DNA profiling rocked law enforcement. Now, almost any trace a criminal left could lead to identification.
We can get DNA profiles from all kinds of body fluids, blood, semen, saliva. We can get DNA from dead skin cells, for example, so it's an extremely powerful method and technique.
In 1993, DNA helps identify the remains of Russia's last Tsar and his family, 75 years after they were executed by revolutionaries. DNA also gives hope to those wrongly accused and convicted. In 1993, DNA unshackles Kurt Bloodsworth, the first death row inmate set free by such evidence. And even when DNA fails to nail O.J. Simpson for killing his ex-wife and a friend, it's not the science that's questioned, but rather the handling of the evidence. By 2004, police in the U.S. alone have used DNA in at least 20,000 criminal investigations. And in Wichita, Kansas, officers on the BTK case hope to add an entry to that list. BTK was murderously meticulous. None of the evidence he left could link him to his crimes at the time. But now, the police have BTK's DNA. Unfortunately, they don't have a suspect, so they can't try it for a match. They fear he'll kill again. So they do as British police did in the Pitchfork case in the 1980s. Run a DNA dragnet. DNA sampling is no longer a matter of needles and blood. The science has evolved so much that ordinary saliva does very nicely.
So we swabbed policemen, we swabbed news people, we swabbed authors of books. Anybody that in the past had demonstrated a knowledge of BTK, they were swabbed also. DNA became the cornerstone.
We took 1,326 swabs in that 11 months.
When men won't give samples, officers shadow them.
So what they would do is follow those individuals until they discarded some biological material, for example, a cigarette butt on the street, and they would collect it and submit those samples to our laboratory. We would get batches of 25, 50 samples at a time and just stay here as long as we could to process as many as we could. With every batch that came off of that analyzer, we would just hope that something in there would match.
The lab checks every sample against BTK's profile. And nothing.
You begin to wonder if you're going to work on this case for the rest of your entire career. I mean, it was like it was never going to end.
Pressure is mounting. BTK could kill again. DNA alone may not bring him to ground. So the authorities appeal to his warped ego.
The one thing BTK liked was publicity. He lived on publicity.
And local media play along.
And we have ascertained that it also is from BTK. I will do a total of 22 press releases in the next 11 months, basically talking to BTK to try to keep him talking and be interested in our investigation.
The tactic works.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation has confirmed that a letter received by KTV and turned over to the Wichita Police Department on Wednesday, May 5th, is an authentic BTK communication.
Well, you never really got time to breathe because every 5 to 6 weeks another communication would come.
The police are betting big, and BTK ups the ante.
And this time it was much more personal. He was ready to murder again.
He was now threatening children. Almost all his communications would indicate that he was going to kill a child. That if he killed again and it was a child, we would blame ourselves.
For 3 decades, investigators have tried and failed to capture the notorious BTK. They have a DNA profile, but no one to compare it with.
Anyone who's ever put on the Wichita Police Department uniform has wanted an opportunity to catch BTK. There were men that in their deathbed were reviewing stories of this case, trying to figure out who he was.
It seems no one ever will. Then BTK slips up. He sends yet another letter, and with it, a kind of digital DNA, a computer disk. Along with the content they produce, computers communicate metadata, invisible but traceable codes. And one keystroke reveals a major clue.
The metadata indicated who the Microsoft Word program had been licensed to. It just gave a first name.
The name is Dennis. The disk also gives a location. It's nowhere anyone expected to find BTK.
The disk had been in the Christ Lutheran Church at 53rd and Hillside in Wichita, Kansas. And the only Dennis within that congregation was the lay congregation, a guy named Dennis Rader.
Dennis Rader hardly fits the image of the vicious serial killer.
He was working in Park City as basically a dog catcher, a code enforcement officer. He was just the guy next door, lived a normal life in a normal neighborhood, had children, had a wife. And that was the most difficult part of all for everybody to accept, that he was a normal guy doing monstrous things.
The task force is ready to take Rader down. But he might suspect they have his DNA. So before they make a move, investigators want to prove Rader is BTK without tipping him off.
We wanted to be sure. The one way we could do that is to get his DNA. We knew that if we asked him directly, he would turn us down. Following him and trying to get a DNA sample that way would be very difficult.
But DNA crosses generations. If Rader is a father, his offspring have his DNA.
So we did research on his family, found out that he had 2 children. One of those children was a 24-year-old daughter, and we were able to obtain, by court order, a biological sample that she had from her gynecologist.
Familial DNA testing is often used in court cases on immigration status and paternity. Now it might help capture a monster.
You get half your DNA from your mom and the other half from your dad. And because of that, we can then look at a sample that we think is a suspected offspring to another sample and do a comparison.
A warrant clears the way for police to obtain the daughter's pap smear. And the sample goes to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation Forensic Lab.
There were a significant shift in the priority of doing samples when we received that particular pap smear slide. We stayed with it until we were done with it.
The results are undeniable.
The father of that pap smear was the individual who left that DNA at the crime scene.
And that is Dennis Rader. On February 25th, 2005, Rader is driving home for lunch when police catch him. And interrogators ask him to provide a DNA sample.
And he ended up matching.
Even after 20 years of painful silence, no new witnesses, evidence, or crime scenes, police have the proof they need. DNA is absolutely definitive.
The probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random in the population would be 1 in 23 quadrillion.
In those 20 years, the arcs of justice and science have intersected. Once, a semen sample might be good for finding blood type, hardly the stuff of convictions. Now, applying new techniques to decades-old evidence, police in Kansas have used a murderer's own DNA to put him away.
Now we know that we have evidence that's irrefutable that it's him.
And Dennis Rader knows it.
At that point in time, he asked about DNA. I explained that we have it from his children and that I know that it's going to be him. And at that time, he admits that he's BTK.
The admission uncorks something in Rader. For 30 hours, he recounts in sick detail each of his horrific crimes.
We had the DNA, we had his confession. It was a slam dunk on his conviction.
Rader pleads guilty. The judge sentences him to 10 consecutive life terms. Without DNA, he might still be out there.
It was a great feeling. It was relief that person that had terrorized Wichita, we weren't going to have to worry about him anymore.
In the years since the BTK conviction, DNA has closed thousands of cases, and the forensic tool chest continues to evolve.
One of the most exciting things, I think, is trying to make the process faster. So right now, the overall process of DNA testing takes around 8 to 10 hours. We've been working on ways to be able to reduce that process to about 20 minutes or less.
Someday, a DNA test may take no more time or trouble than a license check. Soon, scientists may be able to generate a DNA profile from a trace of sweat left behind on a palm or fingerprint. As the science evolves, its power grows exponentially. Now, a DNA profile is simply a set of markers. Someday, it could be like a police artist's sketch.
You could test a DNA strand and give a description of their physical characteristics that would be unique enough to pick somebody up out of a lineup.
But hard facts remain. Forensic science is an art, and tools are only as good as the people using them.
It's not as straightforward as saying, well, we got a DNA profile, therefore he committed the crime. There has to be something else there to corroborate the DNA evidence. We tend to think of it in isolation, but that's clearly wrong.
This revolutionary method remade forensic science, using technology to tip the scales of life and death toward justice.
I think we've actually made a highly significant breakthrough in this. We can truly say that the technique really has taken off and become a worldwide phenomenon now.
It's only going to get better. This has changed so much in the last 12 years, 20 years since we've had DNA now. It's only going to get better.
The city of Charlotte is still a city in shock. 2 women are dead, victims of an unknown suspect.